Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating textual analysis from a source called Divine Blueprint, the case for decentralized biblical governance. When we think of ancient history, we usually picture just this long, unbroken list of kings, emperors, and pharaohs holding absolute, unquestioned power over their subjects, right? We just kind of assume that caste systems, divine right, and iron-fisted rule were the default setting of the ancient world. But today we're going to look directly at the structural themes of these ancient blueprints to see what the text actually says about the origins of governance. Prepare to have some of your fundamental assumptions challenged, because the source material paints a very, very different picture.
So let's just ask the big question right out of the gate. Does the original biblical blueprint actually support human kings? When we think of standard ancient history, like the god kings of Egypt or the absolute monarchs of Babylon, our minds almost immediately jump to images of majestic rulers, royal courts, and entrenched dynasties. We tend to just assume that centralized human power was the original divine ideal across all ancient cultures. But this source material challenges that modern assumption head-on. By looking strictly at the sequence and structure of the text, we find something radically countercultural.
Okay, let's dive into this. The core tension here is incredibly stark. You've got centralized monarchy on one side and decentralized governance on the other. When we evaluate the text chronologically, the analysis points out a major structural theme, and that theme is the deliberate absence of an institutionalized, entitled, or singular human ruler in the original blueprints. We are talking about a system that intentionally avoids setting up one person or family with the inherent right to dominate everyone else. Instead of unilateral human power, the text consistently depicts leadership as distributed horizontally among the people, or held vertically directly under divine sovereignty. It's a completely different paradigm of authority.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be traveling chronologically through the text to build this case era by era. We'll cover creation's corporate dominion, Noah, justice, and Babel, the era of judges, and finally, the shift to monarchy.
Let's start right at the beginning with Section 1, Creation's Corporate Dominion.
The foundational account of creation really sets the stage here, and what the text reveals about the initial mandate of dominion is incredibly specific. Listen to the phrasing in Genesis 1:26. It reads, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea.'" Notice that? The author emphasizes that the mandate of dominion is explicitly distributed. It says, "Let them rule." It does not say, "Let a king rule over men." In the ancient world, it was absolutely mind-blowing for a dominion mandate to be given to common people. Typically, only the pharaoh or the emperor was considered the image of God, endowed with the right to rule. But here, the text deliberately avoids establishing a singular human kingship right out of the gate. It completely democratizes the concept of dominion.
So, the crucial point is exactly how this foundational baseline is constructed. First, look at the grammar. The Hebrew word used for man here is Adam, which the very next verse defines as a corporate plural, mankind, male and female. The mandate is given to the human race collectively, not to an elite dynasty or some special royal bloodline. Second, consider the domain itself. The rule is horizontal and external. It's mankind ruling over the created non-human order, the earth, the animals, the environment. They are not ruling over each other. Why does this matter? Because it fundamentally rejects the idea of a caste system or an inherent ruling class literally at the genesis of the text. According to this textual analysis, God never gave a mandate at creation for one human being to possess political ownership or sovereign entitlement over another human being.
Moving the timeline forward, we arrive at our second era, Noah, justice, and Babel. After the cataclysm of the flood, civilization basically gets a hard restart. And what's fascinating is how the text shows God meticulously avoiding the appointment of a centralized monarch during this phase. The evidence here is twofold. First, we see distributed expansion. In Genesis 9:1, the command in Noah's family is identical to the one in Eden: fill the earth. The goal is explicitly decentralized expansion across the globe, not clustering together under one dominant ruler. Second, and maybe even more importantly, we see distributed justice. Genesis 9:6 establishes the foundational basis for human civil justice. Now, in the ancient Near East, the king was the law. The king was the sole executioner and the ultimate arbiter of justice. But this text doesn't assign the sword of justice to a singular magistrate. It says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed." Placing this immense power broadly into the hands of the community acting under God's law is a massive paradigm shift. It is fundamentally decentralized.
But of course, human nature kicks in. The text highlights the importance of this decentralized plan by immediately showing us the exact opposite, the rebellion of centralization at the Tower of Babel. Nimrod's goal was to build a centralized state, a towering monument to concentrated human power, specifically so they will not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. The source material frames Babel not just as a grandiose building project, but as a direct political rebellion. Imagine the hubris of Nimrod here, making the first major attempt at building an empire. His centralized kingdom explicitly sought to overturn the distributed, community-based plan we just looked at, and the text notes that this autonomous hubris was judged by forcibly fracturing their political centralization, scattering them to enforce that original decentralized design.
Which brings us to Section 3, the era of Judges.
And this brilliantly illustrates what this structural design looked like at its historical high point. For centuries, Israel operated as a league of tribal heritages completely devoid of a central capital, a standing army, and an entitled royal family. When geopolitical crisis happened, the text says God raised up shoftim, or judges. Listen, these were not kings. They were ad hoc, charismatic military deliverers. Their authority was strictly temporary and operational. They led based on a functional spiritual endowment to solve a specific crisis, absolutely not on an inherent birthright or a systemic royal entitlement. Once the crisis was over, they were expected to step down. What is truly wild here is that this completely decentralized system survived for over 300 years. That defies almost all modern political logic, which insists that a nation needs a strong, centralized state to survive in a hostile world. Yet the text presents this as the functioning ideal.
There's this perfect mini-narrative that anchors this era, and it comes from Gideon. After supernaturally routing the Midianite army, the people immediately default to human fear. They want safety, they want predictability, and so they try to establish a dynastic rule. They essentially say to Gideon, "Be our king, you and your sons." But listen to how forcefully Gideon rejects the very premise of human sovereignty. He says in Judges 8, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over us. The Lord shall rule over you." He completely shuts down their attempt at centralization. It's a radical dedication to the decentralized ideal, beautifully highlighting the ongoing tension between human fear, the desire for a tangible king, and the divine blueprint.
Let's move to our final section, the shift to monarchy, and see how this all builds up.
When we map out this progression chronologically, the structural baseline is incredibly consistent. We started at creation with plural corporate dominion. We moved to the Noahic era, marked by distributed justice. We saw the era of judges functioning with non-institutional deliverers. All of this forms a clear, continuous line of distributed leadership spanning centuries. It builds a really compelling climax. But then we hit 1 Samuel. This is the turning point where the Israelites explicitly demand a king so they can be like all the nations. They want the standing army, they want the central authority, they want the human monarch. Now what's really interesting here is how the foundational text views this demand for a king. When Israel asks for a monarch, God tells Samuel, "They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." The source analysis points out that centralized, entitled human leadership is structurally treated here not as the original divine masterpiece, but purely as a concession to human fallenness and fear. It wasn't an upgrade to their political system. Actually, scratch that, it was a tragic downgrade to accommodate their stubbornness. It is explicitly framed in the text as a rejection of direct theocracy. The grand centralized monarchies that we so often associate with ancient biblical history were actually a departure from the original decentralized blueprint. So, what does this all mean? I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. If these foundational texts actually view human entitlement to power as an erosion of divine sovereignty, how should that entirely reshape our understanding of ancient governance? The whole narrative, from Genesis right through the Judges, suggests that concentrated, unilateral human power was never the divine ideal. It's like a giant puzzle that completely flips our traditional assumptions on their head, challenging us to rethink how authority was originally meant to be distributed. I hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity and given you a fresh, structured lens to look through when examining these ancient origins. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this fascinating textual analysis.